Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Very turbulent planet, an overheating planet, still wrapped in a pandemic. Pretty much 2 years since the virus emerged in China. And we are not remotely sufficiently vaccinated around the world to prevent new variants from emerging. And in a lot of hazard zones around the world, we're not remotely, quote unquote, vaccinated, protected from environmental hazards, whether it's fire, tornado, flood, all the things I've been writing about for 33 years. Today, we're going to discuss a lot of these things, but we're going to start in a fairly personal way, looking at a particular lens on what just happened almost a week ago in Colorado, around Boulder County, an area I've spent a lot of time visiting friends, writing about climate change. You can't write about climate change and not spend time in Boulder because of all the science that's there. I'm Andy Revkin at Columbia University's Climate School at the Earth Institute. This is the Sustain What broadcast. This is episode 100 and, actually, no, like 200 something. I don't know. I haven't kept track. And I was stunned the other day, like many people were, when I saw this photograph that we'll close in on in a second by one of our guests, Wendy Cardona, who's a registered nurse. She's one of this army of traveling nurses who are dispatched and move around the country depending on the need in hospitals. And of course, in the last 2 years, the need has been extraordinary because of these surges of COVID impacts, and now Omicron, the variant. We have Chelsea Vargas, who's a surgical technologist who works with Wendy on a surgical unit at Good Samaritan Medical Center in Lafayette, Colorado. And again, I'll show you a bigger version of the picture that Wendy took from the window, one of the picture windows there last Thursday night evening at the end of a long shift. I'll let them describe this situation. Lisa Dale is here. She is a scholar, scientist, and practitioner. She's at Columbia University's Climate School. She's worked a lot in the West on wildfire policy and helping communities find ways to live with fire. You know, this isn't the kind of thing where we're just going to stop living in the West. I lived in California briefly a long, long time ago. So despite the earthquakes and the fires and everything else, people still find the West a very appealing place to live. And disaster zones around the country are like, I'll just briefly say, there was a historian in New Orleans a long time ago who described New Orleans as impossible and inevitable. And it's kind of like we're surrounded by places that feel that way right now, to a certain extent, that are impossibly risky in some ways, but inevitable because of various draws. So let's get into this discussion. Again, it's really great, Wendy and Chelsea and Lisa, to have you. I think I see Brandon Clement, who's a videographer who's been on the disaster beat for a long time. He'll be joining us shortly too. So here was the scene. This was actually after your picture was taken. Andrew Hyde was, who lives in Sunshine Canyon up in Boulder, took this series of pictures. I'm just going to show a couple of them. That showed, it reminds me of images of London during the Blitz, or Dresden, you know, widespread fire in an urban setting, essentially. And this was the just an hour later, you know, when a fire starts to make weather, you know, it's a big fire. And it was big not because of the grasslands it was burning initially. It was big because it was burning houses, hundreds and hundreds of homes full of fuel, from wood to gasoline, propane, and everything. So as that afternoon was unfolding, you guys were at the hospital, two of you, Wendy and Chelsea. So let's just take us through. So maybe Chelsea, let's start with Chelsea very briefly. A little bit what you do as a technologist. Give a quick sketch of that afternoon, and then we'll get to Wendy and her profound photograph.
Yeah, so as a surgical technologist, I maintain the sterile field. I also pass instruments to the surgeon. Basically, I'm the little background helper during all the surgeries. Wendy and I were actually getting ready to do a COVID case, and we were getting our PPE when we saw how crazy the fire had got.
So a COVID case, would this be doing a what do you call it? Inserting a breathing ventilator, or
No, this one was actually just a broken bone on somebody that was actually COVID positive and
oh, I see.
symptomatic.
So you have to go even the extra mile in terms of contagion and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Wow. So Wendy, tell us a little bit about your story. You what is a traveling nurse?
I pick up contracts around pretty much wherever I'd like to go. However, I live in Boulder, so this is a local contract for me. And I had taken a step back from nursing since the start of COVID in 2020 now. I took a break. I was getting a little burnt out from nursing. I decided that it was probably a good time to just take a step back. And I missed the OR, which is what inspired me to take a contract locally. But during that time, I was picking up what we call PRN as needed shifts in area hospitals.
And oh, you just I lost your audio there for a second. Wendy, could you just repeat that last part?
I was doing PRN, which is what we call as needed shifts at area hospitals during the time when I took a step back. But I missed the OR significantly, which is what inspired me to take a local contract.
And now on this day, so it sounds like you were dealing with, at least through midday, fairly conventional flow of.
Yeah, it's just coming in, doing some surgeries, and we were preparing for a case. We were commenting on how it smelled like smoke, and it smelled like there was an increase in smoke. We, of course, kept on. There's the west side of the department faces the mountains, so a lot of us were starting to take a peek at the fires since we were aware of them, and it was just unfolding and looking like things were coming to a halt, and they did.
Yeah, they sure did.
We stopped all surgeries, and then we were waiting on updates and trying to the hospital was trying also getting updates. However, we were very curious and scared, so we continued to view out the west side of the windows, and then we found a room, which I think is what, an X-ray room, or what is it, Chelsea? It's an X-ray room.
Yes. Yeah, it's an X-ray workroom. It's where they do their computer work when they're in the OR.
Yeah.
So someone commented on this room, and I started getting curious. So I came in and I saw this, and I thought, this is quite a striking scene. I need to pull out my phone and take a picture, and I did.
So you had a sense there was something, the lighting and everything was unusual.
I dabble with photography. So I'm an amateur, but I do dabble with photography. I do enjoy photography. I do enjoy taking pictures, and I try to get creative. However, the lighting here and just what I was seeing, everything, just there was a lot going on. It was very striking. I felt compelled to take a picture, and here we are now.
Yeah, and we'll get into that because in your description on your GoFundMe page, you did a really good job of deconstructing what's in this picture. There are layers of meaning here that are really profound.
Absolutely, yes.
But at the same time, it got onto Reddit.
Yeah.
When did you first realize this was kind of making the rounds?
So I took the picture after I think I was trying to explain that there was a lighting situation, so I had to hit night sight. And I feel the need to explain that this is a Google Pixel 5 Android. Not just hoping to close the gap between iPhone and Android rivalry. Took the picture, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, oh, look, this came out pretty cool, because there were a couple other colleagues trying to get a picture. And someone saw it and said, oh, yes, will you please send it to me? So I texted it to 1 to 2 people that asked. And then by Friday, someone messaged me saying that my picture, quote unquote, went viral. And I thought, oh, maybe they got a few more likes. Yes, but no, here we are.
Here we are. Yeah,
Yes.
and it was running around under various names for a little while.
Yes.
But we've all worked it out. And you know, I've taught journalism, and I try to teach young people to respect proprietary nature of a picture.
Mm.
And at this stage, pictures get around, and then it just zooms. And so I was glad to be able to finally zoom in on you, partially through Chelsea. Actually, Chelsea had posted something on Reddit, and that helped me to track through to you. So there's some messages here for young folks, not just young people, but like an image is a moment in time that someone has captured. It's got special qualities. So I wanted to ask you, just as an observer of our world these days, what do you see in this picture?
I think it's a great photo, by the way. So hats off to you, Wendy. Really captures the layers that you've described, but it also, my first take from this was how close that fire got. It was right there. This is not a forest fire up in the wilderness. No. This is a structure fire in town. And I know that area really well. I don't know that particular view from that particular hospital, but I know Boulder, I know Louisville, I know the area. And to see that's not the kind of image that we associate with a wildfire, which we think of as being in a wildland urban interface area, which this was not. So I thought this photo really sort of captured that, and the shock that people had staring out the window, that it brought work to a halt at a hospital in an area where wildfire is fairly common and would not have stopped all the action. This one did. And so it also kind of underwrites how out of the ordinary this fire event was.
Yeah, and that gets at what I wrote today on my dispatch, my blog, whatever you want to call it. I interviewed Stephen Pine at Arizona State, one of the great historians of fire, and others about the state of wildfire risk now. And we'll talk about that toward the end of the show. We think of these things as a grassland fire or a forest fire, and it really only becomes a disaster when we make it a disaster by feeding that fire things like houses. And in this case, the amount of fuel. Stephen Pine said something really just unnerving. He said we've essentially moved a forest into the city in terms of the amount of wood that would be in a forest is there in the city. It's just in a different form in houses. And my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone who's been dislocated by this. And we'll talk about your GoFundMe thing in a second, Wendy, too. The trauma, the disruption, not everyone who moved into these homes knew they were in a wildfire zone, essentially living in a city. Even some of my good friends in Boulder really told me the other day that this feels new, that you think of wildfire risk as being up in the hills, being actually, I'll back up a little bit, being here. This picture was taken in Sunshine Canyon and I think people have this image of fire risk as being right there. There's a little pine tree, not being down in town. So, sorry. Let's get to the next. Oh, actually, there's a couple of good comments that came in. So hold on a second. Yeah, this blocks Lisa for a moment, but Tom Mulesman, who is an old friend of mine who lives in Niwot, right up the way there.
Oh, yes.
And he teaches journalism at Boulder. He says, Wendy, I'm sure others have told you, but this is an extraordinary photo. Without question, one that could win awards. He's also a masterful photographer, so this is, really important statement. And Andy's comment about layers of meaning is spot on. For me, it was the most compelling of all the compelling imagery from that day.
If I may, speaking of layers, I would like to draw some attention and gratitude and appreciation to the EMS that are lined up, ready to transport.
Totally.
So a huge thank you to EMS, firefighters, police officers, everyone jumping into the trenches, ready for action. So a huge thank you to that team.
Yeah, and I can't really zoom in, but you right over Chelsea's shoulder, Chelsea, you're in the middle there, right?
Yeah.
To the left, there is a line of ambulances and fire trucks and first responders. So describe a little bit what they were doing.
They were filing up, ready to transport patients.
Right. And you ended up, the hospital moved something like 55 patients out that day. Is that right?
I cannot comment on
Well,
that. I do not. I cannot speak with certainty.
no. Greg, spokesman said that
Okay.
was the number roughly. And those are all critically ill patients. So doing that is not easy. Chelsea, so you were all kind of basically on call
Pretty much.
as that work was unfolding.
Yes.
Yeah, it went from a normal shift to a trauma call shift really quickly.
Yeah. And one thing that also we have to say, I think everyone was expecting mass casualties.
Yes.
And that did not happen. I'm going to write a whole nother piece about preparedness, responsiveness. There are a lot of plans there. Lisa, I'm sure you've dealt with these kinds of plans in various communities. What did you think about the fact that I'm not going to use the word only, but 2 people, I think it's down to 2 who look likely to have perished out of tens of thousands on the move.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andy, that this is a testament to successful emergency planning and disaster risk management planning. But I don't think that planning is credit to anything that falls under the headline of wildfire risk reduction, because this area was not part of that. This area was not considered a wildfire risk zone. And I actually don't think this fire really qualifies as a wildfire in the way that we normally use that term. This is an urban fire. It's a structure fire that was started and intensified by weather patterns, but it's not a forest fire. And in that sense, it's not really what we mean when we talk about wildfire in the American West. This is a different kind of fire. And so part of what we're seeing here, and Andy, you've talked about this, is the collection of threats that overlap with each other and create sort of cascading and difficult to predict outcomes. And we have gotten, I would say, much better over the last decade at identifying at least the likelihood that some such unpredictable event will take place and establishing protocols and systems to respond to it, whether that's a crime break or a mass shooting or a fire like this or a flooding incident or, the list goes on, COVID-19, et cetera, that these threats and hazards are now interacting with one another to produce sort of feedback loops and unpredictably intense outcomes in unpredictable places to people who aren't particularly prepared. But we have now developed, or at least begun to develop, institutional protocols that are designed for just such unpredictable situations. So I really took the low death count, the low hospital count as a positive reflection on some of that planning.
Yeah, I do too. Sorry.
If I may,
Yeah.
I'm not aware of what the human count. I think 2 people are still missing. I'm not sure if they're deceased or not. Respectfully, I do know that there were several pets
that's right,
were gone, and that as a dog mom myself, that deepest condolences to the families that have lost a pet family member.
Absolutely. I'm a pet dad, I guess. I'm a double dad.
Yes. So
yeah, and you make some of these points here. Wendy has done set up a GoFundMe campaign through which she's directing the money to people who were traumatized by this event in small ways. It's sort of granular and local, and I think that's very helpful. And maybe just describe a little bit about why you call it Project Joy. I think that's a really good idea.
This tragedy has the capability to really send someone's mental health over off the deep end. From personal experience, I know that during times when my mental health wasn't at its greatest, I recognize that and I start doing things that bring me joy and grasping onto that. be it small, be it a long walk, or hiking, or spending time with my dog, whatever it may be. These people lost everything. So if something like hiking brought them joy, they probably lost their hiking shoes or their hiking gear now in the winter time. My efforts are coming from a place of trying to understand and trying to bring any little piece of joy during a time of tragedy, to gain a little bit of traction to try to get through this event as best as possible.
Yeah, Tom's sent another note there that's really pretty wonderful for both of you at the hospital. Here's to you, Tom. I'm going to go to another slide here because
I missed that comment. I was trying to. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'll put it back up. I'd probably lose it if I tried to read it. It brought home to me once again the incredible work that you all do, Chelsea and Wendy, your colleagues, usually under routine conditions, but sometimes under the most extraordinary ones. This is personal for me since I've received life-saving care at Good Sam.
Well, you are very welcome, Tom. Absolutely.
It's my pleasure.
Let's go back to the slides. So now I want to talk about your own personal sustainability. Not yours, just yours, but everyone's. We're in this multidimensional state of confused and consequential signals. We're surrounded by almost as much uncertainty as certainty, even when it relates to something as clear-cut as the pandemic. Omicron is newly emerged. Is it safe? How fast is it going? Is it going to burn through like this flash fire, or is it here? Is it like the rising sea level? What is it? And there's a new one percolating. I haven't had time to catch up with. As long as the world is not vaccinated fully, we're going to see more emergence. And you work in medical care, but you're surrounded by physical risk. So I just thought it worth. I put up here a slide from Susie Moser, who's a good friend of mine, who her work in sociology is focused on care practitioners in adaptation and resilience. It could just as easily be for people working in medical care, for people, doing first responders. And she's trying to figure out a way to boost what she calls the adaptive mind in people. I think it's more than your mind; it's more your soul as well. And when you see, I'm going to click to the next slide. But you can see here, she says, a world facing rapid and constant change, great uncertainty, surprises, and in some instances, outright not knowing, experiencing more frequent traumatic disruptions, heading for or already in transformative change. That's like the energy system is changing. Technology is way faster, evolving faster than we can understand. Actually, Chelsea, you told me the other day, I quoted you on this idea that medicine is getting weirder.
Oh, all the time.
So, let's just talk about that. What do you do to stay functional? Maybe we'll start with Chelsea, because you did, I quoted you on my piece.
I don't know. It's hard. I mean, you just kind of have to accept what is, do what you got to do to help people, and do your own research, I guess.
And Wendy, are there basic principles that are consistent in a changing landscape? Like, as a nurse or just doing what you're doing, is there a certain centering you can do?
Hand washing.
Yeah, right.
Hand washing never changes. Everything else has the capability and probability of changing.
Do no harm. First, do no harm, right? And Chelsea, you were telling me about your job is all about keeping things sterile.
Yeah. I basically make sure that the instruments that get on my table are sterile before they even touch you. So,
yeah.
I guess that's the only part of my job that's not changing at all, is sterility.
Yeah. And Lisa, let's talk about community risk in the same way. earlier I mentioned, I hadn't thought about this before, but vaccination is sort of like preparing, what do you call it? Fire adapted. And a fire adapted community is kind of like vaccinated in a way. It's not perfect, right?
In the sense that it's a collective action problem, right? I
Ah,
mean, that's a really powerful connection, which is, if you have a property, private property, and your property has been, what we would call treated and risk reduced for wildfire, that only does you so much good if all your neighbors still have untreated properties with lots of flammable material and a likelihood of a fire. Your property is likely to still be overwhelmed if a fire should get started. Your outcomes are much higher if your whole neighborhood agrees to do this kind of work together as a collective project. And that's very much the pattern that we see in vaccinations in COVID. If many people say now, if everybody was vaccinated, this Omicron wave would be much lower and much less risk, because the people who are getting sick are the unvaccinated, and society would be bearing a lower burden of that. So it's quite parallel. You can get a vaccine. It does a fair amount to help protect you, but it's only as strong as the vaccines that your neighbors have gotten or not gotten. And so I think, where you're going with this is back to Susie Moser and her sociological take on things, which reminds us, oh, look, there's a quote of me saying the same thing.
yes,
Look
exactly.
at that, Andy, boy, you're good.
I was taking I had set that up. That was not like planned. I'd set that up. A.R. Siders had taken a picture of you and tweeted it.
Oh, that's funny. That before
There you
the
go.
pandemic. But yeah, for planning for wildfire, we are reminded all the time that the sort of mushy concept of social cohesion matters so much for solving these kinds of collective action problems and for recovery after a disaster. If you know your neighbors, if you are tapped into neighborhood resources and infrastructure and planning, you are much better off before, during, and after any kind of disaster than if you are isolated and acting in a solitary fashion. And that's true for wildfire, that's true for COVID, and that's true for this fire, which I will continue to not call a wildfire, but that's true for this disaster as well that happened.
Yeah, for sure. And that's true. I've done shows in the last few months on extreme heat. And Christy Ebi at University of Washington, one of the world's leading experts on climate and heat and health, she said on this show, nobody needs to die in a heat wave. Fairly straightforward. And that's because if you know where the old people are who are living alone without an air conditioner, and you're a neighbor and you have one, that cohesion can lead to survival. And so it's there for heat, it's there for flood, it's there for fire. And I'm sure Wendy and Chelsea, I think you had said something about the community response, even around the hospital.
Yes.
That there's a relationship between a community and a hospital, and that helps sustain everything too.
Mm-hmm.
I want to show the website of the Boulder OEM, because this, I keep sending, if anyone wants to know anything about this fire, whether it's about who set it, whether it's about how to help, and actually they have a big section on what not to, like, don't drop any more stuff off because they're like overloaded with stuff. So BoulderOEM.com is a good place to go to learn about this particular fire. My goal and what I'm trying to write is about transference of knowledge. Like, what can we learn from the experience at Good Samaritan with your work, Wendy and Chelsea? What can we learn about both the successes and failures in the response to this fire that can transfer right down the road there to Fort Collins or Colorado Springs, or to the parts of Oregon that were incinerated? Or how do we have a better conversation nationally to get the good and bad lessons moving around? And maybe a little bit on that from Lisa would be great, because I know you think about this all the time.
I can jump in with one thought, which is, building on what we were just talking about. If we sort of all seem to agree that community cohesion and social ties are a tool for overcoming disaster risk and recovering from a disaster like this one, suddenly the things we should be doing look a lot different than, removing fuels from the perimeter of the house, and starts to look like have more neighborhood potlucks, right? So
Right.
suddenly the idea of preparing for risk and disaster starts to be a much bigger social experiment in remaining connected to our neighbors and to our place. And so I think this has been underemphasized in the research and approach to this issue, and that holds true also for wildfire and high-risk wildfire zones. But it's always something, anybody who's worked on this has made the same independent observation that, boy, those communities that know each other, where the neighbors know each other, where, for example,
Right.
there's not a lot of second homes, but most people live there year-round, where people have kids that go to school together, where people have forged long-term ties with the neighbors' families, those communities are more likely to undergo comprehensive planning efforts because they already know and trust each other. And those planning efforts are then more likely to be implemented with some success because, again, they're accountable to each other in a way that otherwise they wouldn't be, right? And if you're not accountable and somebody's, not following or complying with the plan as was agreed, or feels that plan was imposed on them, we have very different types of outcomes and they're less successful. So
Yeah.
it really speaks to, I think, the limits of planning in a vacuum and the importance of thinking about the context for that planning in a social science kind of way.
Those social sciences come up over and over and over again. I spent 30 years writing about climate change, and it was after like almost 20 of those years that I first started talking to sociologists and psychologists. And it was so mind-blowing because they essentially upended everything I thought, which was that if I just tell people more about global warming,
Right.
they'll do X, and it doesn't work that way. Same thing with viruses, as Wendy and Chelsea know so well. I'm showing a slide here right now. I did, and Wendy and Chelsea, if you need to go, let me know. But we're going to circle back to your goals and stuff in a few minutes. I did a session back in October, which is the annual Great Shakeout, which is an earthquake preparation exercise they do in parts of the country that have significant earthquake risk. And I kind of was saying, well, maybe we need a community vulnerability shakeout, like just a general, hey, look around, what's going on that's dangerous. And in San Francisco, this guy Daniel Homsey, I'm not going to play the video right now, but he's worked out this thing he calls neighbor fests, where they do these. They are potlucks. They're kind of like just get together. Who are we? And it feels to me like if we had more of that. It's really hard right now. Just who's down the block, and well, maybe there is a better plant to plant near our house, and we could really have that potential to get through complexity be higher than it would otherwise be.
So
I'm hoping. Yeah.
I'm loving this message of community and unity. Like Lisa was saying, that houses that are further apart, more perhaps urban, have a higher sense of survival because there's a need. They need each other. And I have a somewhat personal experience to that. My fiance lived on Arkansas Mountain, if you're familiar with Boulder. And houses are very spread out, high fire area. A lot of survival and animal survival was based on just relying on your neighbors, and your neighbors could very well be half a mile away. And during several fires up there, people survived because of the community amongst the neighbors. Whereas further down in more suburban, I think I misspoke earlier. I said urban when I meant rural.
Mm.
But more suburban, urban area, there doesn't seem to be that need. So there's almost a little bit of a divide for whatever reason. So yes, how do we close that? That's a great question. How do we become a community of unity and one?
Yeah, well, I think we're trying to do that here today. I think hospitals, universities can play a role. Any organization, a library, a place that is a nexus, sort of a natural nexus for people. Again, more so when there isn't a virus separating us. But even through this, this medium is awful, but it's something. It's better than nothing. And I'm hoping, I'm showing video from Brandon Clement, who was supposed to be on the show today. He had some technical troubles getting in. I think there are some basic principles we can start to focus on too, in terms of things like fire, which are, as Lisa was saying, there's transference of knowledge that can happen that hasn't really happened yet. And I just hope that every community doesn't have to relive this whole experience. I just 3 weeks ago, whatever it was, a month ago, I was writing about tornado country. And essentially, it's the same phenomenon. There's a general risk of a tornado. There's a warning, and then there's a tornado that takes a specific track through a community. And unfortunately, in that case, killed dozens and dozens of people. And each of the towns around there, hopefully, is taking away the message, as the case here. The Tubbs fire, I can show you a video of the Tubbs fire in California from 2017 that looks exactly like this, sadly. And so my challenge as a communicator is, what can I do to get that knowledge moving around better? And I'm hoping we can all work on that. I want to just go back to the slides one more time because here's
And Andy,
yeah.
If I may, if this is a good time, I do need to get going. I do have another engagement. Is there anything I can close with?
Yes, well, let me pull up your slide one more time and we can close with that. Hold on one second. Well, you were pulled into the public sphere, Wendy, in a way that you probably didn't anticipate.
Completely out of surprise, yes.
So I'm hoping that people will look at this photograph wherever they see it and maybe connect a little bit with the idea of who.
And I hope they think community, unity, help each other out. We are, as cliche as it may sound, we are all in this together. We're going to rely on each other to try and get through this. And that's going to require patience with one another. It's going to involve a lot of mental health issues, traumas. It's going to trigger a lot. So patience and compassion towards one another. Help where you can.
Help where you can and connect. And even if it means using Instagram in a more productive way than sometimes we do. There's ways to use these systems can be put to good use too. So I'm going to cut it short here. Chelsea, thank you so much. Chelsea Vargas, if you hadn't been on Reddit, I wouldn't have connected with Wendy and we wouldn't have the backstory behind this amazing photo. So thank you for being communicative. And,
of course.
and if there's anything I could do to keep at this to help, as the media unfortunately get at an event like this and we go to the next one. Yes. What I try to do here is build conversations and connectivity that can kind of take us forward. And Lisa, we have a lot more to do because, we've just scratched the surface over and over again of these concepts, the expanding bullseye, the just getting familiar with the landscapes around us and building with that in mind. We live within an environment. We're not sealed off from it, even in our towns. And if these messages can reverberate, that'd be great. This is Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School Sustain What episode with Wendy Cardona, with Chelsea Vargas from Good Samaritan Medical Center, Lisa Dale from Columbia Climate School, working in sustainable development all over the world and in fire areas here in the States. Wherever you are, you can share this with friends right after we're done on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, etc. And get in touch with me. And I can get you in touch with our panel too. And we can work to make the world a little bit more resilient every day. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.